Hi, I'm Matthias, and I'm going to tell you that this is the British Martini-Henry rifle Mark I. Well, it is and it isn't, but I have a long story to tell about that, and it makes much better sense if we just go in order and call this the Mark I for now. So, first things first, let's take this to the light box. With an overall length of 49 inches and weighing in just shy of 8.5 pounds, a proper British Mark I would be chambered for the .450 Martini-Henry cartridge, a bottlenecked black powder beauty that is single-loaded in the breech-loading rifle, opened up by a lever on the underside. Almost all of that is true for this rifle today, except for the chambering and some markings. We'll talk more on why in a moment. Today's episode is the first in what will become almost a series, one that I've been trying to start for about 3 years now, having to find and process books and articles, contacting authors and other creators out there, and navigating some weird ammunition issues. The point being is that for every episode of this show you see, I'm usually working in some small way on 4 or 5 other episodes. This massive workload means that the show is a full-time job, one that is funded almost exclusively by you. Neither cable TV nor streaming services are going to pay me to dive this deep on small arms history, so please consider supporting us directly. If you would like to help more indirectly, we actually do now have a continuous sponsor for the show. So take a look at Ballistol for your gun cleaning and oiling needs. Being another black powder episode, we've used up dang near a whole bottle of this stuff just chasing out all of the fouling, which would have rotted away our lovely pieces of history if not for Ballistol. This product, not necessarily in these handy wipes form by the way, is over 100 years old, formulated especially for firearms and technically for infantrymen. If you wipe or spray it on and then wipe it gently off, it will help clean and preserve your artifacts, be they of metal or wood. Mine are mostly made of both. Now, before we get into this particular rifle, we're going to need to set the stage just a little bit. This gun was developed in a period of rapid adoption of metallic breech-loading rifles. Combat in the US Civil War and in the various Prussian victories had revealed that breech-loading rifles were radically more effective than their muzzle-loading counterparts. Ammunition technology especially had advanced enough to give these guns the required accuracy and safety of operation to deliver overwhelming firepower with fewer troops. Breech loaders also made it easier for soldiers to get low and stay low while reloading their rifles. Thanks to one of our previous episodes, most of you know that during the Civil War, a new type of breech-loading rifle had been developed by one Henry O. Peabody. Born May 13, 1826 in Boxford, Massachusetts, Peabody's personal biography is sadly quite lacking. We do know that by age 17, he began work as a machinist and later worked at the U.S. Watertown Arsenal. He would go on to serve as a foreman for the Spencer Repeating Rifle Company, which is where he likely developed his idea for an improved breech-loading rifle. The Spencer was a magazine-fed lever action that has a story of its own. Peabody would keep the side plate lockwork but drastically change the breech block arrangement, making for a much simpler, self-extracting, single-shot breech-loading rifle, patenting his invention in 1862. Peabody would end up granting his patent rights to the Providence Tool Company, who attempted to sell the completed rifles to the US government during the war, especially focusing on its use as a carbine. While it trialed well, the big contracts never actually arrived, and post-war surplus meant a conversion system would be preferred anyway. Again, a whole other story, but the ultimate result would be a cheaper option. Failing in the US, Providence Tool would market the gun abroad, and if you watch our episode on the Peabody, you will get to see all the strange places that it finally managed to turn up in the world. But for today, we'll keep it just a bit simpler and skip right to the Swiss trials of the Peabody rifle. Like so many other nations, the Swiss had come to the conclusion that national security might well rest on the adoption of a breech-loading long gun. Trials began in January of 1866 with 51 actions reviewed. While the Peabody did well, it was ultimately bumped out by the same issues it found in the US, financial conservatism. The cheaper trapdoor-style Milbank Amsler would prevail, but The conversion would mean having to displace a significant number of infantry rifles for a period of time. The Peabody would actually be adopted as a stopgap in limited numbers for just this role, so a nice consolation prize at least. Now, among the many losers of the Swiss competition was a gentleman named Friedrich von Martini. Born March 24th of 1833 in Herkulesbad, part of the Banat region and currently Romanian, but at the time part of the Habsburg Hungary, Friedrich was son to Johannes von Martini, a military doctor apparently working at a spa at the time. At 7 years age, Friedrich was sent to school in Vienna until 1847, when his father was transferred to Transylvania for a promotion. For those of you not familiar with the history of this region, this wasn't great timing. As part of the Hungarian Revolution, roughly 15,000 people were massacred in Transylvania in 1848 and 1849. His father was sent to serve as a physician in the Southern Army in Hungary, while wife and children fled to relatives in Croatia. In 1850, Friedrich started technical schooling in Vienna. In 1854, he moved to study in Karlsruhe, where he graduated before going to work at the local Maschinenfabrik. In 1858, he joined the Sulzer brothers' shop in Winterthur, where he worked as a design engineer. Just a year later, however, he would see military service under Austria as a lieutenant in the engineers, and took part in the Italian campaign of 1859. This was, of course, part of the Second Italian War of Independence, which resulted in an Austrian defeat. By 1860, he was already back in Winterthur. In 1861, he was scouted to serve as chief engineer to the newly founded Swiss company, the Frauenfeld Mechanical Engineering Institute. There he perfected an imperfect bookbinding machine, and along with the factory manager, purchased the company in 1863, renaming it Martini and Tanner. Now, most of Martini's achievements in engineering have actually nothing to do with firearms. He worked on hydraulic presses, embroidering machinery, and even motors in his lifetime. Regardless, the story goes that in 1865, Martini came up with an idea for a breech-loading rifle using a tipping block and apparently a pivoting extractor, much like the Peabody. To be honest, the rifle is so similar to the original Peabody patent, including the use of pins and slots, that I find it hard to believe he had not seen Henry's early rifle or at least drawings. Regardless, he had introduced one improvement, a transfer arm that also cocked the hammer when the breech was opened. Even in trials, the gun took on the name Martini-Peabody because of the assumption that it was a modification of the earlier rifle. Peabody was likely annoyed, but since the gun didn't do well in the trials process, there would be no need for any action legally. The problem had largely been the amount of pressure needed to operate the weapon, because the breech and hammer had to be kind of cocked together, and it created a lot of drag and stacked a lot of resistance. This prompted Martini to consider a simpler solution. From this later British patent, we can see what he came up with. The lever action, tipping breech block, and extractor are all clearly the work of Peabody. But the side lock and hammer are gone, replaced with a much simpler striker assembly nested in the breech block. This whole thing is powered by a singular large coil spring, except of course one trigger spring and this flat spring powered cocking indicator which sticks out the back of the receiver. It's worth noting that Henry Peabody also had considered a striker version of his rifle as early as 1862. However, it had the striker assembly nested down in the stock with an extremely long transfer bar going through the breech block. Martini's improved rifle was apparently ready in time for trials in Austria in late 1866. It made a good showing, but ultimately lost to the native Verndl. That's alright, on to the Netherlands trials. Nope. There, it lost to the Snider, which was a really simple breech-loading conversion compatible with nearly every muzzle loader out there. It's also very cheap. It's worth noting that in both of these trials, the Martini was shipped with 41 caliber Swiss rimfire ammunition, which apparently had a bad habit of swelling and cracking on fire, causing a mix of sticking breech blocks or general anxiety with difficult extractions. Undeterred, Martini would next enter a competition being held by the British government, seeking to secure the best possible breech-loading rifle for their soldiers. At the time, the British Empire had also already adopted the Snider breech-loading conversion system, which was being used to convert their existing Enfield rifles, carrying over the same 5.77 barrels into using a straight-walled metallic cartridge. However, even as the Snider was adopted, the British Ordnance Select Committee was already aware that it was not an ideal breech-loading rifle. Instead, it was a reliable and affordable conversion system which granted them enough time to find the best of the best for the next generation. And to understand what they wanted, we need to take a quick detour. During the Crimean War, Britain had found itself a bit short on soldiers for the regular army. Generally, these would have been filled by, well, frankly, a varied and complicated reserve force thing that had been somewhat neglected after the Napoleonic Wars ended. Following the Crimean, France would begin to expand in power once more, which put Britain a little bit on edge. Matters were worsened by the Orsini affair in 1858, an attempted assassination of Napoleon III by a man whose bombs were actually made in Birmingham. And in 1859, France warred with the Austrian Empire over well, actually this was the Second Italian War of Independence, the same conflict in which Martini served. That same year, the British Secretary of State for War issued a letter authorizing the formation of Volunteer Rifle Corps. I won't go into too much detail on these organizations except to say that they were essentially civilian military prep clubs, spawned a nationwide obsession with rifle shooting. Volunteers soon found the limits of the then standard muzzle-loading 1853 Enfield rifle, and a frenzy of improvements were carried out by the commercial market, driven to provide the best marksmanship possible to the emerging competitions. Even as a breech-loading cartridge, the 5.77 was a short, fat bullet, making it comparatively unstable in flight against, say, something longer and narrower. In the match shooting world, a variety of bullets began to really catch on, with a clear favorite being about a .45 caliber. This was a lead bullet made up with about 5% tin content to make it a little firmer and keep it from breaking up while moving at higher muzzle velocities. Paper patching also emerged as a popular practice. Experiments were also being done in rifling. The most famous example being Whitworth's 1854 patented polygonal bore, where he cut a hexagonal pathway corkscrewing down the barrel in order to twist his hexagonal bullet without having to bite it very severely at all, as traditional land and groove rifling did. Edinburgh gunsmith Alexander Henry would take the concept further. Born June 4, 1818 in Leith, a port region of Edinburgh, Scotland, he served as an apprentice to a local gunmaker named Mortimer before starting out on his own. Alexander Henry would also be deeply involved in the volunteer movement of 1859, apparently being the first to sign up from Edinburgh. Henry was also a fan of sharpshooting, competing in the very first Wimbledon match he tied for the silver medal. As for rifling, Henry developed two forms of polygonal rifling using gentle, curving highs and lows and a tapering bore to guide his bullet into a spin and terrific speed, and yet leaving much less black powder fouling and leading behind in the process. Henry would also create a breech-loading rifle. This was a falling block design using a release lever integrated into the trigger guard. Alright, we have the major players. What are the rules of the game? Well, in the spring of 1865, the British War Department rebooted their same approach which had lured in the Snider. They announced a contest in the national press, which offered to pay £70 each to any competitor for 6 rifles and the necessary test ammo for anyone that actually caught their eye for advanced testing. This amount, however, proved to be far too little. When converting existing rifled barrel muzzle loaders to breech loaders, the costs weren't that bad, but to make a new rifle from scratch, yeah, that money's not going to cut it. With low turnout and no designs clearly displacing the Snider, they decided to try again. Surveying the gunmakers, Ordnance found out that, yeah, their price was indeed too low. The deadline was a little too tight, and most importantly, nobody trusted them at all, for basically 2 big reasons. The first had to do with a court case that finished up in 1865, Feather versus the Queen, in which Robert Bernard Feather's patent for ship armor had been used by the Crown without license or payment. The court ultimately decided that the Crown was entitled to free use of any English patent. While this decision would be walked back quite a bit in later law, at the time it was a huge blow to anyone wanting to deal with the Army or Navy. As if not getting paid for your patent wasn't bad enough, the government also had invested heavily in their own arms manufacturing capacity. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield would be producing any new long gun for the British forces, meaning no guarantee of funds of any sort if your design was adopted. The newly reformed Select Committee would have to overcome these concerns in order to get their peek at the best of the best rifles. So the competition was modified and announced once more, and there would be better prizes. For the best overall firearm presented, £1,000, £600 for the best breech loading mechanism regardless of the firearm as a whole, £400 for the best cartridge, no matter what firearm it was presented with, and in a small nod to a sort of side project, £300 for the best magazine arm, which was being considered with a lot of trepidation. British Ordnance really wasn't big on magazines just yet. One prize per person, and the prize was not affected by whether or not your rifle was actually adopted. The announcement also made it clear that should a design be adopted, the inventor's name would be broadcasted loud and clear, and assigned to the final rifle in service, thus earning them more fame and probably more contracts abroad. Now, of course, you couldn't just send any old firearm that you happened to cook up. No, there were expectations, parameters laid out by the committee. For the firearm itself, the weight must not exceed 9 pounds 5 ounces without bayonet. The overall length is expected to be 51 inches. The muzzle and foresight must permit admission of the present service bayonet. The stock must carry a light metal cleaning rod and allow for a sling. The lock type was optional, but it must be capable of 12 rounds a minute of unaimed fire. For the cartridge, the caliber was to the discretion of the inventor. However, accuracy from a rest must deliver a mean figure of merit under 36 inches at 1,000 yards. The trajectory was not to require a rise of more than 1 degree 30 minutes at a range of 500 yards. Penetration was to be at least as good as the Enfield rifle, 12 half-inch elm planks soaked for 48 hours in water at 30 yards. Recoil was not to exceed the Enfield rifle by more than 10%. The cartridge must carry its own ignition. The bullets must be waxed, however additional lubrication as needed could be used. And 60 rounds packed for service must not exceed 6 pounds 4 ounces. As for endurance, after 250 rounds of fire, fouling should not deteriorate precision by more than 20 inches at 1,000 yards. There were, of course, the usual demands that both rifle and cartridge be rugged enough for military service and safe to operate, unlikely to detonate. You get the idea. All rifles were to be British proof tested and submitted with drawings and 20 sample rounds by March 30th of 1867. These would be submitted to a cursory trial, following which the committee would select a handful of rifles to be produced for more advanced testing. If you were selected, you would then have to supply 6 identical examples along with 6,000 rounds of ammunition within 4 months of the request. Because of the great cost, £300 would be paid to cover this lot of rifles and ammunition. Not that it particularly matters to our story, but there were some differences if you submitted a magazine firearm. The weight could creep up to 9.5 pounds, and you would receive another 60 pounds per rifle should you be accepted for advanced testing. The magazine issue, however, really wouldn't come to a head for another 2 decades. As a matter of fact, the officers and engineers of the committees would eventually find themselves in a bit of hot water over their complete unwillingness to really look at true magazine solutions at this time. But that's a topic we'll cover in another episode. Ultimately, the Select Committee would receive 37 rifles, which conformed to the rules laid down, and another 67 that did not, but they were still reviewed to some degree. These were tested for accuracy, safety, soundness, rapid fire, exposure to the elements, recoil, fouling, and assessed for ease of manufacture. After some whittling down, 9 firearms were selected for further review. The Albini and Braidlin, not 1 but 2 rifles from Burton, 1 from Fosbury, the Jocelyn, which had actually done well in trials before, the Remington rolling block, the Peabody sidehammer, the Martini derivative thereof, and the Henry we just mentioned. All of these men were told to provide 6 guns and 6,000 rounds of ammunition. The committee would reconvene in late October of 1867, but some of the guns were still missing. A mix-up with French customs had detained the Martini, and Burton had to make 12 guns instead of just 6, so some extra time was given. It was also decided to use the Service Snider as a control for the experiments to come, which began in November and would continue into February of 1868. There was, however, a 10-day break for Christmas. Now, if you'd like to know more of all these gritty details, I'd really recommend checking out the currently available book, The Martini-Henry for Queen and Empire by Neil Aspinshaw. However, for our show today, I'm going to put my foot on the gas a little bit. All of the rifles were submitted to a battery of tests, the usual accuracy, endurance, fouling, etc. And the results were frankly quite mixed. There were some clear losers though. The Remington and Jocelyn both managed to blow up, and quite frankly, a few rifles struggled with long-range accuracy. Curiously, the Martini's cartridge problems came back again, and they frequently tore, blew gas, and generally gummed up the action. Perhaps because of this, it was noted that the design was especially strong and safe to use even with bad ammunition. The Henry rifle, however, did manage to lay down the most wins, especially in the long-range challenge. His .45 caliber hollow base bullet with its paper patch kept fouling down and managed to suffer nearly half the deviation of the next competitor at 800 yards range. However, it's doubtless that the complicated construction of his rifle, along with its lack of mechanical advantage, was causing some concerns. Ultimately, no one was judged to have truly won the competition as a whole, so there would be no 1,000-pound prize. And they wonder why people didn't trust the government. Alexander Henry did, however, receive the 600-pound prize for coming the closest to an acceptable design. But not necessarily the best breech government. This is a bit weird, because you could argue that he had actually used the best cartridge. That prize, however, went to London gunmaker Henry Daw, which is where things get kind of complicated. Frenchman Francois Eugene Schneider had patented an improvement of the previous Potet center fire design. This patent had been purchased by Daw, who adapted it further. This was a rolled brass cartridge with an iron base. It would also be the basis, but not the final form, of our cartridge today. Overall, this second trial had been yet again a failure for the committee. So in December of 1868, it was announced that they would try again, this time focusing more on the actions and less on the details of the rifles overall. The matter of ballistics could be largely kept separate over here, meaning 2 concurrent trials could begin, one for the action of the gun and one for the rifling and the cartridge to be adopted. On that front, they decided on a 35-inch barrel length. The barrel weight should not exceed 4 pounds 6 ounces. It should be bored for a .450-inch cartridge, which should use a 480 grain bullet weight and 85 grains of loose black powder. The case should use the aforementioned boxer construction and beeswax lubrication. The barrels would be fitted to Henry breech actions, as these had been the best in the previous testing and were more readily adaptable to the .45 cartridge than the Snyders that were in production. Barrels were provided by Lancaster, Rigby, Wesley Richards, Whitworth, and Dixon and Boxer. But in all testing, the Henry barrel performed the best by far, at extreme ranges in particular. It was only at or within 300 yards that it became sort of about as good as the others. While the barrel testing was underway, the committee was also reviewing a myriad of breech-loading small arms. Soon, a new shortlist would actually re-emerge. Rifles from Bacon, Carter and Edwards, Kerr, Wilson, all the aforementioned, by the way, were bolt actions. Wesley Richards, again, Burdan, the first one, not the bolt action, Money Walker, and of course Martini and Henry would also fill out this list. Ultimately, the committee was not enamored with the notion of a single-shot bolt-action rifle. They were aware that the system was used in many early magazine repeaters, but the linear thrust of the bolt really freaked them out, mostly because of the possibility of an out-of-battery discharge, which would be particularly worse if the breech block was allowed to blow back into your face. 2 of the bolt actions, the Carr and the Bacon, would actually fire out a battery with enough fouling and force in the testing. These ultimately drove the committee to dismiss all of the bolt-action designs. Regardless, all the rifles were considered rapid loading enough. All passed the sand test. All of the rifles seemed to struggle with the exposure testing, where they were allowed to rust for several days in the extreme weather. Except the Martini, which was fine so long as fresh ammo was used. The iron bases of the Boxer cartridges tended to tear off when stuck. Overall, the Burdan, Money Walker, and one of the Wesley Richards designs were eliminated. At this point, basically the British were favoring either a tipping or a falling block. It wouldn't be long, however, before the other Wesley Richards design was dropped from consideration. At this point, the concerns about the Henry were starting to actually stack up a bit. It was more prone to seizing than the Martini, and again had a more complex construction. Ultimately, the only concerns for the Martini came down to ammunition woes once again, because of that terrible original cartridge it had. So they asked him to produce a rifle for the currently considered straight wall 45 caliber Boxer cartridge. This arrived in October of 1868, but was technically overweight. However, Martini was on hand and pointed out the simple extra operations to reduce its mass. Orders were given to produce another sample from scratch with Martini's oversight at the Royal Small Arms Factory. During the same time, Alexander Henry produced an improved version of his own rifle, mostly focused on keeping the firing pin from sticking and keeping the cartridge rim from sneaking past the extractor. The improved rifles were again tested: long-range fire, rough handling, exposure to the elements and rust, and the criteria were again whittled down. Both rifles were safe, both were strong, but the Martini had fewer parts, and there was some concern about the Henry's extractor, which required an assembly soldered to the barrel. And even so, it was still possible to get the cartridge rim past the extractor, causing a jam. The side block of the Henry was also disliked, as the hammer could become entangled or even broken off in service, whereas the Martini was encapsulated. And to top it all off, the Martini was self-cocking, meaning fewer hand motions in reloading. So, thanks to independent trials, the Martini breech had won out, but the Henry barrel was clearly superior. The obvious solution? Attempt to hybridize them. The Royal Small Arms Factory was put to work making 6 rifles with supervision by both Martini and Henry on their respective components. 4 were produced with the existing 9-groove Henry rifling. 2 were trialed with just 7 grooves, as Henry had found out that this was cheaper to produce, increased muzzle velocity slightly, reduced fouling, and had almost no effect on the precision of the gun. 2 versions of cocking indicator would be used on these rifles. Once again, we've already seen the simpler rear button type indicator in the earlier patent. This indicated the cocked or decocked condition of the rifle. The other type, which had apparently been in use throughout most of the trials so far, was a large external arm, mounted on the right side of the frame. I believe this also offered the option of recocking or riding down to decock the action. This also would have allowed the Martini to use a half-cock safety notch if desired. Neither option was ultimately preferred. The button type was ditched entirely, and the side lever morphed into an extremely simple teardrop shape, which allowed the user to see the cocked or decocked state of the rifle. With these matters settled, 200 trials rifles of the now Martini-Henry were ordered from Enfield in June of 1869. The chosen pattern looked like this: 2-piece stocks, a massive overall length of 51 inches, a ladder rear sight adapted from the Service Snyder. The barrel was of course Henry rifled 7-groove, and the action with its large looping lever was Martini. This was fitted with a fairly large teardrop cocking indicator and a sliding manual safety. Sling swivels were set in the buttstock, ahead of the trigger guard, and at the forward barrel band. A 1-piece cleaning rod of simple construction was set under the barrel. There was no handguard, and we can't see it here, but the butt plate has a trapdoor for a cleaning jag, which went on the threaded end of the cleaning rod. It also had room for an ebonite muzzle protector inside. It's worth noting that this pattern of receiver was longer than what we see today in our episode. That's because the cartridge provided was a straight-walled 45 caliber Boxer construction, which ended up being quite long in order to fit the necessary powder load. This thing was 3 3/4 inches long. These cartridges would actually become a problem, as they were too easily damaged given their layered construction and long layout. So rifles were then set out for trials in Aldershot, Gravesend, and Hythe. They were also sent further to Ireland, Canada, the Cape Colony, and India. Also, the Royal Navy, who floated around with them wherever. While all that was cooking, the committee actually received an interesting report in the spring of 1869. The Royal Laboratory at Woolwich was having success with an interesting cartridge submitted by William Thomas Ely. In order to fit the same amount of powder in a shorter cartridge, Ely had chosen a bottle-shaped case. The lower body was larger in diameter than the neck, which held the bullet. The short length meant the ability to shorten the action of the rifle. It was also more rigid and less likely to bend. And finally, the angle also helped reduce the risk of the paper patch being rumpled up on loading. Small problem, the Ely cartridge was based on the Boxer patent, which in and of itself was fine enough as Colonel Edward Monnier Boxer was the superintendent of the Royal Laboratory at Woolwich. His cartridge was already in use in the Snider rifle. However, Boxer's cartridge was built off the Schneider patent, now in the hands of Daw. Ely's 1869 patent went further still. He describes a four-sided die forming the bottleneck while creating extra support ribs from the excess material. The die then spun these down onto the bottleneck, making it more rigid. This, of course, spurred lawsuits, which are a bit beyond our scope today. Returning to the guns, several of the long-action rifles were made in the newer cartridge, and then two more specifically shortened for the new bottle-shaped round. These side trials led to other improvements, like adding a beeswax wad and changing the type of gunpowder in use in order to get the best performance in all temperatures. By October of 1869, a new directive was in place to make the swap to the new ammunition. Rifle trials data, however, wouldn't start coming back until March of 1870 and took until July to really stack up. I remind you, this is with the long straight wall cartridge. Overall, the new rifles were felt to be superior to the Snider in nearly every way, but there were still some issues. The ammunition was easily damaged. Thankfully, this was already resolved back at home. The rear sight position wasn't great for marching, and its rear notch was a little too shallow. Okay, fairly easy to change. There was some concern about the balance of the rifle, which was a bit too far forward. The cleaning rod worked loose too easily, and there were an oddly high number of shooters who managed to punch themselves in the nose when firing the rifle for the first time. Finally, and most importantly though, there were a lot of misfires. This was actually noted very early in the trials. In attempting to lighten the trigger pull, Enfield had apparently gone too far. The Striker's coil spring had been reduced from the trial's weight of about 40 pounds to just 26. Replacement springs were issued out fairly quickly, and those units that received them reported massive improvements in the reliability of detonating the ammunition. Meanwhile, 24 new trials rifles were in construction specifically for the competition at Wimbledon, as well as some additional testing. These were presented to the committee as they were produced, and as the series progressed, a number of smaller improvements were actually adopted. Most notably, further simplifying the cocking indicator, making it one axis pin piece. These rifles performed excellently in competition, especially at the 800-yard range. They were also fitted for a unique trials bayonet, designed by Lord Elcho of the Select Committee, who had bulked up the Royal Irish Constabulary's Snider bayonet. This was a long machete-like saw-backed affair meant to provide a utility knife to the soldier. The Elcho would find a lot of praise throughout the rest of the trials, but was ultimately abandoned due to its high cost. By December of 1870, the testing was largely over with, and in February of 1871, the committee was ready to publish its results. Given the numerous personalities involved in the commercial market and their many political connections, they also opted to hire 3 expert civilian engineers to take a supposedly unbiased look at the final rifle. These reports were very positive and were used to sort of beat back anyone saying that they had been unfair in their selections. Around the same time, a shortened and lightened rifle, now with a barrel only 33.2 inches in length, was produced for the Navy. They quite liked it, but wanted their own cutlass bayonets. This would be a modified form of the pattern 1861 cutlass bayonet that could be produced from altering existing stocks. In March of 1871, the Council of Ordnance decided that the naval-length rifle would actually be acceptable for universal service. In April, the Secretary of State for War authorized production to begin on the Martini-Henry rifle. When this made it to the House of Commons, all hell broke loose, mostly because of pressure from the domestic gun industry. The matter was pacified by a mix of the previously mentioned independent engineers' reports and a promise to allocate some production to the Birmingham gun trade. In October of 1871, the pattern would be designated Rifle Breech-Loading Martini-Henry Mark I. Other differences from the trial's model include a lack of a butt trap, a cup added to the stock for the end of the lever, a bronze axis pin for the breech block meant to avoid seizing with rust. A checkered notch was also set in the right rear of the receiver behind the axis pin. This was meant to give the shooter a thumb rest, which allowed for slightly more control without having to wrap around the wrist, which tended to stretch the hand and often resulted in the aforementioned nose bopping. At the same time, the Ellie-modified boxer cartridge with Henry-styled bullet was finalized as the cartridge small arm ball boxer Henry 450 Martini-Henry short chamber Mark I. It's a mouthful. Debates over the aforementioned Elco bayonet meant that none was actually officially adopted. In the interim, conversions were done on existing pattern 53 socket bayonets and the pattern 60 yataghans. Without going into too much more detail, the first pattern of the Mark I rifle had a fairly big problem, one that was introduced by Enfield Superintendent Colonel William Dixon as an attempt to improve the trigger pull of the trial's rifles. Dixon's solution was the addition of a sear thingy known as a tumbler rest. This took on the role of a sear, but met the tumbler with a rounded, polished surface. At least I think. I'm working from some really weird drawings here. The rest was then notched against the trigger, and while this did manage to even out the pull and possibly lighten it, the extra part introduced a dangerous failure point. The Dixon trigger was prone to inertial displacement, which means if you smack the butt hard enough, the gun might go off. That's not ideal, especially in drill. Enfield artificer Todd would provide a solution, a modified rest which prevented the movement under inertia. This change was approved in October of 1871. Martini would in turn file a British patent for a modified form of the Todd trigger, although I'm unsure if it was used commercially. Now, of course, it took some time to trial the new trigger, but with this and some other very minor tweaks, most notably further softening the exposed edges of the trigger guard, a second pattern of Mark I rifle was approved in September of 1872. By this point, approximately 60,000 rifles of the first pattern had already been completed. Now these needed to be hauled out of storage and refitted with the new trigger group. Whoopsie, at least they hadn't been issued out yet. Now, the pattern 2 basically gets us to this rifle here with some very minor caveats, but I'll explain those as we take a closer look. Alright, we have a fairly long, and elderly rifle. Let's get this on back. There we go. But it's not actually a British Mark I. I want to say that right at the front. This is an Ottoman contract made by Peabody in the US. Providence Tool. We'll talk about them more in our next episode. However, if we disregard the markings, this is otherwise identical to what would be a Mark I second pattern, and frankly an early version of that, because it still has its manual safety. The safety is clearly the first thing you'll notice compared to a normal Martini that would help you understand that this is probably one of the Mark I rifles. But there's going to be some other clues. Let's go ahead and talk about those. If we get all the way to the back, our buttstock is going to be slightly shorter on average. We'll cover that in the episode more. We have a lower sling swivel on the early guns. These would actually be removed in service fairly often, so don't be surprised if this is filled in with a wood plug. While we're talking about sling swivels, by the way, the more common position is here in front of the trigger guard, and then all the way up at the forward band right there. For stacking the guns, you would actually interlace your cleaning rods. In this case, this is a reproduction Mark I cleaning rod, and this is actually one designed for a 450. I fitted to this gun so that we can go ahead and get a look at what it should look like. It's very bulbous, it has a taper to it, and it's too big, obviously, to fit down this bore because this one's not in 450. However, it really wouldn't fit down the bore of 450 either, because the way the cleaning rod was designed is that the threaded end, which is buried all the way down in this stock, would take a jag, and that jag would be what you clean down the bore with, and this gentle taper keeps you from roughing up the crown. That means that you can't insert the rod all the way through the barrel. That would actually become a problem we'll talk about later. While we're at this end of the gun, we have a fixed front sight. We have, well, just a lot of forend, no handguard whatsoever on the entire length of the rifle. We have a rear sight that is actually fairly far forward. While it's not marked in the Arabic numbers we're used to, you can get the idea. This thing has a tangent base, which allows us to slide our cross key here and get, yep, just a nice tangent deviation for the first few hundred yards. If you want to go longer range, well, we flip this on up. The ladder would then be graduated, all the way up to here, and you can technically use the top notch as a further volley marking, so these can be quite long ranged. Specific to the early Martinis, we have a bronze axis pin with a lock screw that fits into a groove in that pin. So one of the big problems with these guns is that this would work itself loose, just takes a quarter turn really, and then that guy can fall on out under repeated firings. This is something that they would change in the future. We also have a lock screw, by the way, and this stays with the Martini, on this cross pin, which is actually part of our cocking indicator on the other side. You know what, let me give us just a little bit more room. The way this rifle works is fairly simple. You open the lever, or rather drop the lever, in order to open the action. And if you notice, this guy, he's moving with our lever just a bit there, isn't he? That goes ahead and opens up the breech block. This allows us to load a cartridge, and I want to point out there's a little bit of tension in the breech block right now. I don't know if you guys can make that out. When you take a rimmed round and insert it into the chamber, you compress that extractor into filling out the corners of the chamber. That'll be more important when we go to open the action. And at the same time, as you push in, you actually end up tipping the breech block down just a little bit with the rim. Once the cartridge is in place, that breech block snaps up just enough to grab the cartridge rim at the bottom and keep it from falling out of the action unintentionally. That's a little thing, but a very critical one. From here, we can just close up the action, and we have a chambered, supposedly live round. Obviously, we haven't put anything in this gun. And we have a couple options. We can turn on the safety, which in the case of this gun has suffered, terribly with age, but we managed to click it over, and oh wow, there's no wiggle at all. This thing actually has a wedge in it that fits so well in that trigger, there is no movement whatsoever, which is good because you can't get a ride over when you, oh my god, push it back off. This, you guys will see the mechanism for this in the animation, but let me tell you, this is not mechanically advantaged. Even a well-oiled, cleaned up one of these is a little difficult to slide back and forth because inherently when you're pushing at the top of this, you're levering it in a way that it doesn't want to move. It's a very uncomfortable little feature of the gun. Now, with the safety off, we can go ahead and pull the trigger on this guy. And you'll notice as we drop our firing pin, our cocking indicator comes forward. That means we can know that the gun is currently decocked. If we need to, we can just recock it by working the action. If we do it slow enough, we actually won't lose the cartridge to the extractor. But generally, you have a spent case and you want it out of the gun, so you'll lever good and hard. When you do, this little guy right here will be in the chamber, and the act of levering it will cause pressure to pop it out. See it tapping out? Let me go ahead and push that back in, and once more for the camera, although it doesn't behave perfectly. I wish I had a snap cap. Boop, pops right out. That'll throw our cartridge clear. You'll see that better when May gets a chance at the gun. And I guess for anyone curious, this thumb pad is, well, a thumb pad, a checkered rest for your thumb. That keeps you in this nice position, gives you some control of the rifle without having to cross your thumb over where it's going to whack you in the nose with that short stock. Also, while I'm up here, I should go ahead and point out, this feed path here on the original British guns, I'm actually unsure of the Ottomans, was left in the white, nice and bright and shiny. The reason this was done is that when you open the action, it would serve as a mirrored surface to allow you to see down the bore. So in other words, you could look in the front end of the barrel and see how dirty or any problems with the rifling a lot easier by, you know, just looking down it and pointing this guy up at the sun, and he'd act like a nice big reflector. Unfortunately, he also acted like a nice big reflector, which was annoying, and more importantly, without finishing this and with all the black powder, especially here at the breech, these things would rust up real fast. So that did not remain a feature, as we'll see. Giving the shot's a little tricky, but hopefully you can make out these very, very obvious checkered lines on the buttstock. These are, of course, a feature only of the Mark I rifles. Now, one of the most critical parts of this being a Mark I rifle is the fact that it has an extra piece in the trigger group. That would be the tumbler rest. You can't see it here, there's no sign of it externally, but we can show it to you in an animation instead of me having to take the rifle apart. It'll also be clear how it works. Before we cut to that though, I do want to say thank you, Brandon, for loaning me this. I wish I had known you had it sooner, because we actually filmed the shooting segment with a slightly different rifle, but with the same trigger assembly, so it shouldn't affect things too badly. Now, of course, we can't see the unique trigger tumbler rest arrangement without dismantling this piece. Or even better, let's just go ahead and have Bruno animate it.
For its time, the Martini-Henry is notable for having just 3 controls, although one would soon be deleted. The most iconic is, of course, the underside lever arm. We simply pull this down in order to tip open the action. Now we can load our cartridge, and with the same lever, close it back up. This operation is deceptively simple, made possible by some ingenious geometries. The most direct and obvious operation of the lever arm comes from a set of extensions, which fit in a specially shaped hollow in the breech block. When we lever open, the extensions strike the inside rear surface of the hollow. This lower rearward pressure pivots the face of the breech block down. As we'll see in a moment, this clears the spent case and gives us room to insert a new one. When we lever the action closed, the extensions press on the inside front of the hollow, forcing the breech block back upwards. The extensions then settle into a special groove meant to keep the block firmly upwards when in battery and especially when firing. Throughout this whole process, the shooter is receiving assistance in the form of a 2-position bias, but we'll have to go deeper to see how. First though, let's hit the more obvious. This is the extractor, an extremely simple tipping yoke that comes straight from the Peabody rifle. Levering the breech block open drops it on the extractor, tipping it sharply, yanking the case from the chamber. With the lever released, the breech block springs back up a bit off the extractor. Loading around presses the extractor forward again into a matching recess in the receiver and barrel. The Martini-Henry is a striker-fired rifle with a massive striker, powered by a very heavy coil mainspring. The striker is controlled by a rotating tumbler, with a top extension that projects through a channel cut into the striker. The tumbler is essentially a hybrid sear and hammer. It's constantly being pulled forward by the sprung striker, but is held back by, well, this is called the rest. It's a sort of pseudo-sear, which prevents the tumbler from rotating forward, but doesn't use a traditional hard notch. Instead, the 2 mating surfaces are fairly rounded. This component was added to the Martini design in order to smooth and even out the trigger pull. The first version was prone to releasing under inertia. This is the Todd version, wherein the trigger positively prevents the rest from rotating unless it is pulled. By the way, the trigger is tensioned by this simple flat spring. So let's pull the trigger and watch a Rube Goldberg release of the striker, which slams forward on the primer, discharging our round. Now, let's talk bias, because this is genius. The tumbler has a bulbous tip, which is shaped specifically to work with an incline cut into the rear of the channel set in the striker. When cocked, the spring tension wants to push the breech face down into the open position, but our lever extensions are preventing that. When the rifle is fired, the tip of the tumbler rotates such that the spring bias is now biasing the action shut, and with the mainspring extended, the pressure is greatly reduced. When the action is opened, the tumbler is cocked back, again stacking spring pressure. At full extension, the lever over-rotates the tumbler, further compressing the mainspring. Releasing the lever lets this bounce back, biasing the bolt into a specific position, which has been designed to keep the action open, ready for feeding. And finally, another unique feature to the Mark I, the manual safety. This is a simple sliding plate held into one of 2 positions thanks to a flat spring that fits into one of 2 detent notches on the safety's upper surface. Sliding the safety rearward drives it under the forward edge of the trigger, preventing it from rotating and the gun from being fired. Sliding the safety forward frees the trigger to be pulled once more. Alright, that should have it. Another system that seems deceptively simple on the surface, but hides a myriad of little interactions in order to work properly. A frankly lovely piece of engineering.
Now, all of those features are found in this particular rifle, and technically, they're also found in this rifle, which has an even more convoluted story. There's one little extra change in this one, but again, guys, just trust me, it's going to get less confusing if I do this in order. These guys don't quite fit in our timeline, so why do I have them? Well, nearly every single actual British Mark I would eventually be converted into something else, notably the Mark II. That means that if you want to see a Mark I, the easiest way to do it is to get a hold of an Ottoman contract. That's, well, easier. So we're actually going to shoot one of these Ottoman darlings, and we're going to pretend real hard that May's actually using a 450 cartridge, when in reality it's a slightly different cartridge that we're going to talk about another time.
When half your bullets fly wide in the ditch, don't call your Martini a cross-eyed old bitch. She's as human as you are, so treat her as such. And she'll fight for the young British soldier. But first, we really need to get you out of your pajamas. Right, quartermaster! Yes! Something for Private Winchester here. Yeah, something in red. Yeah. I didn't realize he was that much of a magician. All right. Now, firing proper now. So, on the word of command, ready, you will sharply draw down on the lever and chamber a cartridge. Following that, pull sharply up on the lever and hold the rifle at the waist. Ready! On the word of command to present, you will throw the rifle out to the fullest extent of the left hand. Then draw it sharply into the shoulder, taking your point of aim. Present! On the word of command, fire. You will... fire. Fire! Ready! Sharply now, sharply. Present! Fire! 2 rounds, independent firing! Commence!
Boom. Who was that mustachioed gentleman anyway? What a strange man to find on the range. Anyway, I don't know why I'm putting this down. I need this. Back to the history. Because even within the moniker Mark I, this wasn't going to be the end. But first, let's talk about some production. Of course, the original producer would be the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, and they did so continuously until they had enough. We'll get you a final number later. Contracts were then let out for 38,000 Mark I rifles to both Birmingham Small Arms Company Limited and the London Small Arms Company Limited, which were both surprisingly chummy about who got to produce what. The price paid by the government, £3, 10 shillings, 6p per rifle. There would be a number of delays, mostly from the government. This actually ended up costing BSA especially a lot of money. But eventually, the commercial guns started rolling out. In June of 1874, another 9,000 would be ordered, and then in December, another 30,000 on top. Both of those manufacturers had been involved in Snyder production, and while I'd like to explain their histories more, I'll save that for the Snyder episode, because this one's already very long. While this was going on, continued trials were revealing some faults, particularly in the cartridge of the new, well, firearm. With repeated firing of the rifle, eventually fouling would build up in the chamber, or, given the construction of the cartridges, gas leakage quickly added additional fouling into the chamber. Regardless, sticking would start to occur, which in and of itself wasn't a major problem, except when paired with the fact that the Mark I cartridge base was a separate piece which readily tore off. So the case walls were thickened up and the cup deepened. This resulted in the Mark II cartridge, which in trials demonstrated no real improvement. Dang. So, thicker brass once more, wrapped twice around with a half-inch overlap. Another sheet brass coil was laminated into the bottom third of the case. A small oval or rhomboid view hole was actually punched in the outer case to allow inspectors to check on that inner addition. Even still, a second outer base cup was also fitted. The interior was lined with shellac varnish, and it was all filled up with a new powder. Introduced in March of 1873, this would become the standard cartridge for the next 2 decades. Further rifle trials at the Hyde School of Musketry and with various foot and rifle battalions revealed another problem. The rifles were proving to be a bit inaccurate. To be clear, they were mechanically as precise as ever, but the troops' performance wasn't all it could be. The problem was placed on that massive recoil. This would lead to experiments resulting in a Mark IV cartridge with lightened bullet. However, despite making nearly 3 million of them, the cartridge was declared obsolete in 1875, with all remaining examples broken up to become blanks, and the bullets going on to be used elsewhere, as we'll see in, oh boy, yet another Martini episode. More so than the ammunition, though, the blame was also put on the ergonomics of the rifle. It was then decided to extend the buttstock by 1 inch, providing a better length of pull for the average soldier. It's also worth mentioning that there were, from the entire time that this rifle's been in construction, 2 lengths of stock at any one time. The previous patterns used either a 13-inch long buttstock or a 13.5-inch long buttstock. The new pattern was either 14 or 14.5, the shorter representing 2/3 of production. At the same time, it was found that the checkering on the butt plate wasn't all that helpful, so it was dropped in order to save money. And while we're talking ergonomics, the angle of the trigger was tweaked slightly. Problems with unstacking arms in the field and difficulties in removing, you know what, I have the wrong gun for this, the cleaning rod, that's the one that's on this guy currently, resulted in a new pattern which managed to snap in place and was given less than 1 full turn in order to release. We'll actually see that better in our episode on the Mark II rifle though. The manual safety was felt to be fairly useless. I hate this thing. Especially thanks to the improved trigger group. So it was dropped in November of 1873. With the approval to remove it from rifles in store, it seems that there was no effort made, however, to remove the slot cut in the assembly, which would prove to be a problem later on. It's worth noting that you can therefore rarely find second pattern Mark Is that lack a safety and yet don't have all the other improvements. Like the fact that another problem was found in mass production. The mainsprings and strikers were cracking up. While the springs were merely a matter of honing in on the correct tempering, the striker was more difficult, likely brought on by the British Army's use of dry fire training. Over the course of 1873 and into 1874, a new thicker striker was developed and a breech block altered to accommodate it. This became the pattern 1874 breech block, and a 74 was marked on the side of the block so that it could be readily identified going forward. At the same time, the decision was made to fully brown even the feed path of the breech block, as this proved to be way too hard to keep rust-free in the field. To further aid the striker problem, it was also decided to introduce a snap cap for dry fire practice, helping to reduce strain, in theory. Another problem was found with the bronze axis pin, which had a habit of working loose after repeated firing. A threaded pin was trialed but had the same problems. In the end, a split head pin was trialed both in bronze and steel. The bronze had a habit of slacking, so the steel became the solution. But wait, there's more. The issue of grip was still not quite resolved. The thumb pad wasn't cutting it, so when all these features were added to a series of yet more trials rifles, they also included 2 patterns of external thumb rest. I'm not exactly sure how they looked. Neither was deemed acceptable though. Another failed trial edition was that of a laced leather handguard. Sustained fire had resulted in very hot barrels and poor bayonet handling. While a leather handguard was trialed, it was not adopted at the time. We will see one later on though. All the improvements together would result in a new sealed rifle, the third pattern, still Mark I, which was introduced after over 140,000 rifles had already been completed, meaning another conversion program, averaging a cost of 9 pence per rifle. This was probably covered in the long run, however, because the simplified third pattern was cheaper to produce overall. The sealing of the third pattern trials rifle finally stopped development long enough to begin issuing the rifles to troops. So these would be the first Martini, well not these, the third pattern, would be the first Martini-Henrys to actually be given to soldiers en masse, beginning in October of 1874. That's quite the development time. I'm sure it's perfect as was, and there would be no further problems. Oh wait, we don't like the butt swivel, said the government in January of 1875, so they removed it and slapped in a wood plug, which upset the rifle brigades, so they were allowed to put their swivels back at the armor level by drilling out the hole, and Jesus guys. Now of course, once these rifles entered production, there was a clamor sent up by inventors who felt that they had been cheated. And for this gun, or really the pattern 3 too, there are only 3 names that really matter. Alexander Henry, Friedrich Martini, and don't forget Henry Peabody. Thanks to British law at the time, no one could collect from the Crown on rifles manufactured at the Royal Small Arms Factory. However, because the government contracted for commercial production and paid a price that included a commercial profit, well, that changed things. Those guns could be targeted, and the manufacturers should have negotiated for the patent rights. Neither had done so because they were told by the government director of contracts that they were protected by the department against the patent holders for the government contracts. This, however, was untrue. Alright, time to follow the bouncing balls for just a moment. Friedrich Martini, living in Switzerland, probably didn't want to be fighting over his patent in and out of court for years. Not just chasing around those using it, but also avoiding Henry Peabody's prior patent on which his was based. Martini almost solved both problems in 1868 by negotiating the sale of his patent rights to Providence Tools agents in England, James R. MacDonald. And just as a reminder, Providence Tools the one that held Peabody's patent. A draft agreement from Martini dating from 1868 acknowledges the Peabody as the precursor design. It has been suggested that Providence Tool was likely going to spend £6,000 in order to secure the Martini patent. However, it appears the deal never went through, likely for lack of funding on Providence Tool's part. Instead, Martini would end up selling to Wesley Richards for £45,000, a much better payday, although this was in December of 1871 after adoption. It's also worth mentioning that Martini did not take a prize sum that was offered, £5,000, as he felt it would release his patent to the Crown, and again at the time there was some debate on whether the feather case would be walked back or appealed. With the Martini patent in hand, Wesley Richards formed the National Arms and Ammunition Company Limited in January of 1872. This was actually done over a contract with the Prussian government for 150,000 Mauser rifles and cartridges to match. This was a bit of a disaster as they missed delivery times and the contract was ultimately cancelled incomplete. But the NAA would also take on the Martini patent. Martini himself would continue to reject offers up to £5,000 from the government. A, that was the prize money anyway, and B, he didn't control the patent anymore. Alexander Henry had taken his £5,000 prize money, but had also sold his patent rights, which became property of the newly formed Henry Rifle Barrel Company, based in Blenheim Works, London, England, which was formed in order to produce Martini-Henry rifles for the government and Henry barreled rifles for commercial sale. Both the NAA and the HRB companies would sue the commercial producers of the Martini-Henry, and despite the initial assurances, LSA and BSA, the manufacturers, lost in court. Henry Rifled Barrel was apparently owed roughly £5,500 from both manufacturers for their use of barrels so far. This was considering a 2 shilling royalty per barrel. National Arms and Ammo made out even better, though it took a few years to settle the matter. They pulled a £50,000 settlement of unpaid royalties. Going forward, they also secured a 4 shilling 6 pence royalty from other commercial manufacturers. Providence Tool, again holding the Peabody patent, got bupkis. Apparently the courts did not favor them, and by the time it was really in dispute, their much older patent had expired. Royalties and lawsuits aside, some 475,000 Mark I Martini-Henry rifles would be completed by all three manufacturers through 1876. The private factories actually continued on for the longest time with the Mark I, as we'll soon see in another episode. Enfield would be the first to change over to an improved Mark II. Okay, the rifles are made. They're in the hands of soldiers scattered across the world-spanning empire. How did they actually see service? Well, as far as conflict goes, the first real campaign was likely the Perak War, which took place in northwestern Malaysia. The Sultan of Upper Perak allied with local chiefs and attempted to push out the British influence, murdering Administrator James W. Birch on November 2nd, 1875. Following which they planned on attacking Bandar Baru, although they had to abort due to rain. British reinforcements were sent from Hong Kong and Burma, likely with Martinis, and on November 7th of 1875, 106 British soldiers would skirmish with the Malaysians in the first battle, which actually saw the British in retreat. They were, however, reinforced by 300 men in 80 boats, and over a series of attacks against the Malaysian forces and their fortified positions, the opposition was crushed by mid-1876. There was also the 1877 conflict, now called the Ninth Xhosa War, though the papers at the time called it the Kafir War. This one actually started as a bar fight between the Fengu and the Kekaleka peoples. Reprisal attacks escalated matters, and soon the Cape government was drawn into it. While they attempted to keep the British imperial forces from becoming involved directly, there were those who saw a chance at territorial expansion. British Governor Bartley Frere frankly poured fuel on the fire by disarming all of the black peoples of the Cape, including the colony-loyal Fengu, who had long served as their frontier forces. Meanwhile, as the British forces advanced into the Kekaleka territory, those rebels snuck past and invaded the now largely unarmed Cape. It was just a wee bit of mayhem. Ultimately, the war dragged into a year-long mess until overwhelming British power, combined with actually using the Fengu troops once more, saw a victory. The empire was expanded, and the same tactics would largely be used to kick off the famous Zulu War. The Mark I Martini was also likely still in common use at the start of the Second Anglo-Afghan War in 1878. In this case, the Russians had forcefully sent a diplomatic mission to the Emirate of Afghanistan, prompting the British to demand the option to do the same. The Emir refused and threatened to stop one if it was sent, so of course the Raj sent one, which was turned away, because they said they would, at the eastern entrance of the Khyber Pass. This, of course, prompted a war, as in November of 1878, the British sent out a force of 50,000 men and promptly conquered the whole country, forcing a treaty in May of 1879 from Muhammad Yaqub Khan in the first phase of the war. Rebellion then set in, and the second phase lasted until the Battle of Maiwand in July of 1880. So, by victories alone, it would seem that the Martini-Henry did quite well. But there were still some fairly big problems with this rifle. Not the least of them was that it had a propensity to simply go off on its own. However, we're well deep into a long episode, and I think we'll talk about that issue when we get to the Mark II another day. Now, this is usually when I say we should have May in for a conversation about the rifle that we've just discussed and fired, but this is just a stand-in for British equipment. It isn't chambered in .450, so I think we'll use our very next episode to go into detail about how this gun came to be, exactly this gun, and then ask May's opinion with the correct ammunition and everything in place. Until then, I'm going to actually immediately sign us off and tell you all to have a good one. All that aside,
Yep.
we said we were going to do no travel.
Yeah.
And then immediately I got an email.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was one of the few things we said we would travel for.
Yeah,
the timing just worked out that it happened to be this year.
They're going to make us go to California.
Yup.
Oh, God.
That's
of all the places I have to go, it's the furthest and the most unfriendly.
Mm-hmm. Well, the furthest attached to the United States.
That's true. I don't know of one available at all for shooting because they're insanely rare.
But at least it does have the Mark I sear arrangement that will be a good differentiation between that and the two.
Yeah, literally the gun that we got a hold of for filming is it was actually sold to the Japanese, and it's an Ottoman Type B, which is a Mark II receiver. However, the internals are all Mark I. So the only difference is the axis pin. That's it. It's a Mark I with an axis pin that is split instead of being bronze.
Okay.
So perfectly acceptable for handling and understanding, weight, balance, trigger feel, which trigger feel is the big one because of the sear difference, which you guys will see. I think we got it.
It wasn't unusual for us to have firearms, so I never considered, actually weirdly, instead of...
As a young lady in the South, you were probably told, if someone comes in this house, you go ahead and shoot them, young lady.
Well, that's actually where I was going with it.
Sorry.
No, that wasn't where it was going with it. No, it wasn't necessarily even brought up for that. I saw guns as tools because we hunted. And mostly it was just, birds and whatever, but... Regardless, to me, it was a tool to use to get the bird so that we could take it home and then eat the really sad amount of meat that is on a quail because there is just not a lot of meat on them small-ass birds. For the amount of time and effort you go out there to knock some quails down, it is not worth it for the little tiny bits of meat you get off of them.
I grew up hating guns because I couldn't get a whole chicken. If it were loaded, that is. And then to reload, you would... go to your half-cock position, you would pull down on this trigger guard, which is actually an operating lever, and at that point, I'm biased into this position. You can see how positive it is. Clunk, clunk. One of two positions. In the open position, it drops the breech block. Let me get you a better shot of that.